Good afternoon, and welcome to another episode of Between the Pillars, a video podcast series. This is the series from the Fisher Library where you get to meet both our staff and learn something a bit about our collections. And unfortunately, as you can see, we're still doing this remotely. My name is John Shoesmith. Sometimes I forget to introduce myself. I'm the outreach librarian at the Fishers, and you can see neither myself nor today's participant, Andrew Stewart, is at the library. The province and the city is again under a stay-at-home lockdown order for the next 4 weeks or so. So we're going to be doing the next few of these podcast series remotely. But that doesn't mean that you're not going to learn something, that you're not going to find some of the treasures at the Fisher. And I do like to remind people as well that even though our doors are closed at the Fisher Library, we are still offering some virtual services, virtual reference services. So please go to our website to see how you take advantage of those, and just look at our website too. They've got a lot of really cool things on there. Some online exhibitions. We have a blog. So even though technically we're closed, we're not closed virtually. So the Fisher Library is still operational. So I want to introduce Andrew Stewart. Andrew is our reading room coordinator at the Fisher, and we're titling this, he titled this himself, called Backlog Adventures, and we're going to explain a little bit about that as we go along. So as I said, Andrew is our reading room coordinator, and actually, Andrew, maybe you could tell us, I asked you beforehand whether you came to us as a student. You said no, and you started describing all the different things you've done at Fisher. So maybe you can give the Reader's Digest version to people to say, how did you come to the Fisher, and what kind of different roles have you taken at the library?
Sure. So I've had a bit of a complicated journey. Basically, I graduated from the Master of Information program at U of T, and then that summer, I started working at Fisher at the exit control desk part-time.
Mm-hmm.
So that I always
the first point of contact for people that visit the library.
Exactly. So I always say it's half security, half cataloging.
Right.
Because you're the person who has to explain to people how the library works, but then in between people, you're cataloging material.
Right.
And so, during that time, I kind of had a Franken job of 3 different jobs while I was doing a second master's of history.
Right.
And I've had several jobs at Fisher in the meantime, but now I'm the reading room coordinator.
Yeah, because you left us for a while too. You were working at Robarts for a while.
I did. I went to collection development.
Okay.
For a year.
Yeah. So then when you came back to us, so in terms of your reading room coordinator role, how long have you been doing that?
That I think it's been 2 years now.
2 years, yeah. So basically, anybody that's come to visit the library and used our collection in the reading room, most likely Andrew was the one that's been handing you the books and the materials. But like everybody at Fisher, we all assume so many different roles. So outside of just being the reading room coordinator, what are some of the other things you've done within that position?
So when I'm not in the reading room, generally I'm cataloging. So I usually have 3 or 4 cataloging projects on the go at any given time. Right before shutdown, the first one, right. I had just finished working on a huge Darwin collection of about 5,000 books.
Okay.
And then I usually have smaller projects on the go. So if we get a small donation of 1 truck or something and it doesn't fall under anybody's subject specialty, I'll take it on. And then I have my long-term project, which is the Backlog.
Okay. Do you have a subject area specialty?
I don't. So I'm one of the rare people at Fisher who doesn't focus on one particular area of scholarship. Bit of a jack of all trades. So essentially, a lot of material comes in, and if it doesn't fall under somebody's area, it usually comes to me because they don't have time to start cataloging things outside of their areas because they've already got enough to do. So,
and that's probably useful too in terms of actually going through the backlog. And actually, maybe you could explain to the uninitiated. I mean, because obviously, as librarians, we understand what the backlog is, but maybe to those that may not, aren't in the weeds like we are, maybe you could just explain what a library backlog is.
So I should start off by saying that having a backlog is not unique to Fisher.
Mm-hmm.
I would hazard to say that every special collections library and museum has one. They just often don't talk about it because it's accessible.
Right.
And Fisher's backlog is a little odd in that it mostly comes from the 70s and 80s in particular. Essentially, these are all items that are just uncatalogued and therefore they're not in our online system and they're not accessible to the public. And in the 70s and 80s, it makes sense that we have a backlog from then because the library building had just opened. So I imagine it was fairly empty and they seemed to make a concerted effort to buy as much as possible, as quick as possible to build up a collection. And they would buy entire libraries. And basically when they came in, they would pick the things that would be the highest priority to catalog. and the rest they would leave for later. But unfortunately, later didn't come for a lot of those books.
Right.
Up until a few years ago when we started actually having a push to get through a lot of this backlog.
Do you know how large the backlog actually is?
It's quite sizable. As I say, it's a long-term project. There's about 180 boxes of books left to go, bankers boxes, and each bankers box can have 20 to 40 books in it. When I first started working on it, we also had a separate section called the pamphlet backlog.
Right.
It was about, I would say, 100 archival boxes of pamphlets, and each box could have 40 to 50 pamphlets in it. But that we actually finished. So
okay.
Those are all available now.
So where is the backlog kept? Is it kept at Fisher?
It used to be, and then about 5 years ago, two of the librarians went through it and again cherry-picked the items that they thought should be the highest priority. And those were put in the workroom with a little sign saying, please take some of these books in between your regularly scheduled cataloging, and the rest were sent to our offsite storage facility. So that's where they are now, and we just call them up as we have time to work on them.
Okay. And so in terms of the material that's in the boxes, they're not probably done by subjects area or anything. So I mean, how do you go about choosing which books to bring back?
So they are actually arranged by accession numbers, so that works out to being just the date that we acquired them. Mm-hmm. And I try not to cherry pick boxes and books because that's how things ended up in the backlog to begin with. So I just grab a whole bunch of books and I just work through them as they go, whether the book is really hard or dull or really interesting. Because I think that's a dangerous game to play with myself, because then at the end of the backlog, if I did it that way, it's just going to be all of the ones that I don't want to work on.
Right. Yeah, we used to call those Uggs, because those are the ones you always want to leave for last.
Yeah, that's not to say that I don't have an Ugg pile like most of the staff members at Fisher, but I try to keep it fairly small.
Okay. So why don't we you've chosen some materials that you've discovered while going through the backlog. So why don't we take a look at some?
Sure. So before I show the first one, actually, I'll just tell you a bit about the ephemera collection, which is also it was part of our backlog.
Right.
And that was the first project I worked on. And essentially, it grew mostly, it started from things that were taken out of books. So if there was a bookmark or a train ticket stub or something, the librarians would take them out of the book so that the acid in the paper didn't damage the book.
Right.
And it started, a pile, and then staff members would bring stuff in, add it to it, and it got quite large. And so one of the librarians, I think it was Luba Frestaki, I went through and organized them by subject. And that was the first project that me and my colleague Jason worked on.
Okay.
So the first thing I'm going to show you is actually from that collection. Oh, there's a preview there.
There we go.
So it's hard to pick one thing from the ephemera collection to represent the ephemera collection because it's everything. Yeah. But these are German banknotes from 1922 to 23.
Right.
And if you look at the denominations, that's the interesting thing about them. They're 10,000 to 100,000 marks. Now, this was a period of very severe inflationary crisis in Germany. Mm-hmm. And at the beginning of the crisis in 1922, 160 German marks would equal $1 US.
Right.
But by the end of the crisis, it was 1.5 trillion marks to the US dollar.
Wow.
Which, as someone who is really not good at math, I cannot imagine having to deal with several high value notes, like hundreds of thousands of marks notes to buy a loaf of bread, but that is what people did. There are stories of people bringing entire wheelbarrows full of banknotes to the grocery store. If factory workers got paid for the day, they would often run to the store after work because they didn't know if the next day their money would actually buy what they needed, because that's how quickly things changed. So paper money essentially became valueless, and it was treated as such as waste paper. They were used as, to start fires, as toilet paper, as bookmarks, which is how I suspect some of these came to be in our collection.
Right.
And the interesting thing about these too is they really helped. Well, didn't help. They hurt the Weimar Republic and the liberal democracy in Germany by kind of showing how, they were seen as a destabilizing force and very chaotic, and that helped give rise to the right and Nazism later in the decade.
When you get some of these materials, I mean, what kind of research are you putting into before you catalog them or after you catalog them, or, in this case, probably created a list? I mean,
Yeah, so the ephemera collection we just made finding aids, so basically just a list of all the material in each box by subject. So this box is labeled money. Mm-hmm. And there's all kinds of different forms of banknotes from all different eras in history in there. Usually I didn't have to put too much effort into looking into things, but sometimes I had no idea what it was. For instance, we had a revolutionary note called an assignat from the French Revolution.
Right.
And I didn't know what that was. And of course, part of the thing at Fisher is if you find something, even if you can catalog it without looking it up, you kind of want to know what you're dealing with.
Yeah.
So that actually turned out to be church property that was all taken over by the French Revolutionary government and then issued in the form of bonds.
Mm-hmm.
And this represented part of confiscated church property. So like, there's all kinds of weird things in the ephemera collection. But.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to move on to the next item we've got.
Sure. So the next item, it doesn't look like much, but I promise it's interesting. So this came from part of that pamphlet backlog that I was talking about. And this is a political pamphlet from the 1650s in France from a civil war known as La Fronde. It's a very complicated civil war, so I won't really get into the weeds on that one. But suffice it to say that Louis XIV was too young to take the throne, and so his mother, Anne of Austria, was the regent. And her first minister was Cardinal Mazarin, who was almost universally hated, partly because he was a foreigner, he was Italian, but also because he was seen as sort of a puppet master, sort of like pulling the strings of the female regent and the young king.
Right.
And if you wanted to criticize the monarch, you couldn't do that because it's treason, but Mazarin was open season. So these pamphlets are called Mazarinades because most of them directly attacked him, sort of as a scapegoat for anything that people didn't like about the crown.
Right.
And they were highly illegal. In fact, the printer of this one, Anne Boisset, spent several months in prison the year he printed this pamphlet for printing these. And they look quite rough, and that's for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
This one says it is the thanks of the printers to Monseigneur the Cardinal Mazarin. And it's essentially the printers of Paris giving thanks to the Cardinal for being such a bad guy. They've printed so many pamphlets and made so much money. They're rolling in it now. The only problem is they don't have enough ink and paper because Paris was actually under siege from the royalist forces. So
right.
There's a reason why these look so scruffy. They're printed on pretty nasty paper because that's all they had.
Right.
And most of them were actually only saved because some people bound them in volumes of collections of them.
Mm-hmm.
And often ours still have traces of marbling and gilt edges and holes where they were bound into other volumes.
Interesting.
So they look rough, but they're actually quite interesting.
Right.
And I actually ended up writing my master's thesis on this one particular pamphlet, which you couldn't get much more specific in a thesis than writing a 30-page thesis on a 4-page pamphlet. But
yeah, exactly. Was this fairly typical of what was in the pamphlet backlog then?
Oh, so it really runs the gamut. There were brand new, well, relatively new 1980s, quite dull things. But then there's things like this, which are surprising that they ended up in the backlog. In fact, there were about 200 of these pamphlets. Mm-hmm. We bought them in, I think it was the early 70s, and they just sat there uncatalogued for about 35 years.
Yeah.
So I'm glad now that we've got them all done and they're actually available to people.
And for those that don't know, the RB number that's on that folder, that's our extension numbers.
Yes, and we did not write the numbers on the actual pamphlet itself. Those are probably the number that they were assigned when they were bound in a volume.
Yeah.
There were about 5,000 of these pamphlets printed. Oh, actually, no, I know what that number is. That comes from the main reference source for these books. They were all assigned a number by this guy who wrote the main bibliography on it. So that is the number that corresponds to the bibliographical entry.
Interesting. I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah.
So what else do we have here?
So this next one is just kind of quirky and weird and kind of represents the odder side of the backlog. So this is a lecture on heads by George Alex Stevens from London in 1802. And it is currently housed in our science collection, but it's not really phrenology. It's more a book of satire.
Okay.
So it's organized as though it's a man standing on a podium showing you a bunch of heads from different characters of Georgian society, and then basically ripping them apart in satirical prose. So the first one we have is Sir Whiskey Whipple. It says, he is one of those mincing, tittering, tiptoe tripping animalculae of the times that flutter about fine women like flies in a flower garden, as harmless and as constant as their shadows. They dangle by the side of beauty like part of their watch equipage, as glittering, as light, and as useless. So this, I think, is pretty clearly a dandy. And the author does not take too kindly to this kind of frippery.
Right.
Beside that, I thought this was kind of fun too. It's a pile of wigs on top of a bunch of books, and it says wigs as well as books are furniture for the head.
Hmm.
And then, of course, the next one we have the old maid, the typical character in Jane Austen novels and shows.
Yeah.
And it very unkindly refers to her as an antiquated virgin. And it says, it is a period when elderly unmarried ladies are supposed to be bearing apes about and leading strings as punishment, because when these elderly unmarried ladies were young and beautiful, they made monkeys of mankind. Which I think is quite a funny image.
Yes.
And then next to her, of course, you have the old bachelor, her counterpart, who isn't also looked at very kindly either. They say they're bullies who basically always make fun of marriage and married men, saying they're henpecked husbands, but in fact, they're also quite lonely, sad individuals. And what I think is kind of interesting about this book is it kind of is representative of the sort of item that often ended up in the backlog.
Mm-hmm.
They don't necessarily fit neatly into our subject strengths. Like this is put with science, but it's not really science.
Yeah.
But it's sort of phrenologically related. And often the things in the backlog, either they're very dull or they're more on the humorous satire side. So I'm assuming when they came in, they just weren't seen as more immediately of research interest.
Right.
So we're left aside for later.
Right. So you've cataloged this as part of our History of Science collection. Is that right?
So it went into JAH, our Hannah collection.
Okay, so the medical.
Yeah, this was a debate where to put this one, but it is presented as though it's a lecture on phrenology, and it's sort of talking about the different kinds of heads and how they correspond to society. So that's where it ended up, but it could easily have ended up in the general collection as well. So the next item I have also looks a little rough, but this is an emblem book.
Right.
So emblem books were very popular, particularly in the 17th century. And this one is one of the better known examples. It's the Amorum Emblemata. And it was written by Otto van Veen, I think I've got, yeah, that's it, from Antwerp, 1612. And this is Emblems of Love with verses in Latin, English, and Italian. And I have found several of these sort of emblem books in the backlog, and they're all very amusing when I find them, because as you'll see, essentially an emblem book is an image with a title that describes the image, verse that satirizes the image and usually has some sort of moral component, and they're just intended to instruct and delight. So Cupid is a very common theme. As you can see, this one, he's looking at himself lovingly in the mirror.
Right.
And the verse attached says, out of sight, out of mind, and basically says that if he turns away, he's going to forget all about who he's in love with and then forsake them. So the opposite of absence makes the heart grow fonder. The next one, often in these books, Cupid is brutal. He is just shooting people left, right, and center. So this one, he's got a poor, hapless young man tied up against the wall who also appears to have been pinned to the wall. There's like a piece of metal coming out of his chest, and he's using him as target practice.
Right.
So I think this is kind of trying to show you that sometimes lovers are unwilling and tortured.
Love is harsh.
Very harsh. And some of them are really funny. Cupid will, and one I saw, he was shooting an old woman and a young man, or a poor beggar and a rich person. Like, they're just meant to be funny little images. This last one's my favorite. It's a trial made too late. So Cupid has shot this guy. He's fallen in love with this woman, but he waited too long to tell her, and he died. And so he's holding this staff with their hands holding on it. I believe this must be his profession of love. And there she's all sad because she missed her chance. And Cupid is looking like, come on.
All right.
What I love about this is it shows you that, you know, people in the 17th century had just as much a sense of humor as we do. They just presented it a little differently.
Yeah.
This to me sort of makes me think of like a BuzzFeed top 10 article on relationships.
Right.
The 17th century version. Yeah, so that's all we really had to show you today. But I just kind of wanted to show you these items don't necessarily relate to each other. They're all kind of idiosyncratic, but that's the backlog. It's just a collection of very odd items that are stuck together. So
what do you think, maybe this is a not fair question, but what do you think a backlog tells us about a particular library or a library's collection? Especially because obviously these were items that were not originally decided to be cataloged. But yet they're so charming and engaging, so many of them. I mean, does a backlog, going through the backlog yourself, has it told anything about about the Fisher?
Yeah, I mean, you can see sort of the changing nature of scholarship when you look at things that weren't considered to be as important.
Right.
I've noticed a lot of things in the backlog have to do with sort of like the more mundane, everyday side of life.
Hmm.
Things like this that are just more meant to be amusing to people. Like there's no serious aspect to those. But equally, I've also seen, for instance, a lot of books in Indigenous languages,
Hmm.
Canadian material.
Right.
And I'm assuming when the person first looked at them, it's not that necessarily they thought they were unimportant, but they're kind of hard to catalog
Right.
because a lot of them are in sort of the European made up version of what, for instance, Blackfoot would be. So you open it up, and if you don't know how to read that, it is triangles, circles. It's not in an alphabet that's easy to work with. But a lot of them also have enough information in English that you can work with them.
Right.
But yes, you can definitely see the changing nature of scholarship.
And I mean, I guess it helps. You seem to be fairly fluent in a number of different languages, or at least you can read, as I say, you can read the title page.
Yeah, so because I'm such a generalist, I've sort of stumbled across material in so many different languages that you just kind of have to figure it out.
Right.
And so I would never call myself fluent in most of these languages, but I have title page knowledge.
Right.
Um, yeah, sometimes unwillingly, I've even had to. It's like so if we don't have someone who speaks a certain language, I don't always want to have to go to whoever at Robarts speaks that language and bother them for help.
Right.
The book doesn't look that important. I've had books before in Cyrillic where I have had to figure out how to Romanize the Cyrillic,
Right.
translate it, and then make sure I've cataloged it so people can search. And those can take a very long time.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
So how many more boxes do you have of ephemera of the backlog to go through?
So much. I mean, we've done the pamphlet backlog, we've done the ephemera, and I think I've got through about 10 bankers boxes that were offsite. I've also finished all of the books that were originally cherry picked from the backlog that were in the workroom.
Right.
So the priority items are done. And so now I'm working through the stuff at our offsite storage facility. So I think I've got about 170 boxes left to go.
It'd be nice when we open again. You can get back to that.
I know I can hear the books calling my name, asking to be cataloged, but I'll have to wait a little longer.
Okay, this is great. This has been really interesting, Andrew, because I mean I don't know much about the backlog myself, so it's been an educational experience for me. So thank you for participating, for being
Oh, you're welcome.
a guest today, and we look forward to seeing what you come up with in the backlog over the next 35 years, maybe, that you will be working at Fisher's. So so it's going to be great. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody for joining us for another episode of Between the Pillars. We have another one coming up in 2 weeks at the end of April. A little bit different topic. We're going to be looking at French manuscripts. So please join us for that. So hope everyone enjoys this lovely spring weather, and we will see you in 2 weeks' time.